My parents mistreated me during my childhood, so I left them. Now with my grandfather leaving me money, my parents want it as compensation for their parenting. I'm 32 and grew up in a household where money and appearances were everything. My parents were obsessed with material possessions and social status, but never cared about being good parents or creating a loving family environment. They were selfish and focused solely on their own wants and needs. From my earliest memories, I felt like an afterthought in my own home. My parents' relationship was chaotic at best. They'd have explosive arguments followed by extravagant makeup gifts. I'd hide in my room during their fights, covering my ears to block out the shouting. When things were calm, they'd ignore each other and me. My mother came from old money but had been cut off by her family for reasons I never fully understood. She resented this and was determined to prove she could be wealthier on her own. My father, from a working-class background, always had a chip on his shoulder about it. He was constantly trying to show he belonged in high society. Together, they were a toxic mix of status-seeking and materialism. Growing up, I never had what I needed. My clothes were always old and worn out because my parents thought spending money on kids' clothes was a waste. I rarely got new school supplies and had to make do with leftover pencil stubs and half-used notebooks. We lived in a big house in an upscale neighborhood, but my room was basically empty, except for a bed and a desk I found on the curb. Meanwhile, my parents constantly bought new cars, designer clothes, and went on expensive vacations, usually without me. I started working part-time jobs when I was 14, lying about my age to get hired. My first job was at a local grocery store, stocking shelves after school and on weekends. By 16, I was working over 30 hours a week while going to school full-time. I had jobs at fast food restaurants, as a gas station attendant, and mowing lawns. Anything I could find. My parents took most of my paychecks, claiming it was for rent and to teach me responsibility, but I knew they were just using me to fund their lifestyle. The rest of our family couldn't stand my parents. My mother's parents had disowned her years ago, and my father's family, while not wealthy, were kind, hard-working people who were disgusted by my parents' behavior. My aunts, uncles, and cousins on both sides slowly cut contact over the years. Even my paternal grandparents, who lived nearby, rarely visited. I later learned it was because they couldn't bear to see how I was being treated. I have memories of birthdays where no one showed up because my parents hadn't bothered to invite anyone or had actively discouraged people from coming to avoid wasting money on a kid's party. One year, when I turned 12, I got up excited for my birthday only to find the house empty. My parents had gone on a weekend trip and forgotten it was my birthday entirely. I spent the day alone, heating up a frozen dinner and watching TV. Christmases were no better. I'd get nothing or maybe one small cheap gift while my parents exchanged expensive jewelry, electronics, and designer items. One Christmas when I was 9, I got a used coloring book with half the pages already colored and a broken toy car my dad had found in his office. Meanwhile, my mom unwrapped a diamond necklace, and my dad got a new Rolex. I was often left home alone for days at a time, starting when I was about 12, so they could go on trips. They'd leave some money for pizza and tell me not to answer the door or phone. I spent those days in constant anxiety, jumping at every noise and worrying about what would happen in an emergency. School was a challenge because my parents couldn't be bothered with any part of it. I had to forge their signatures on permission slips and report cards. Parent-teacher conferences would come and go without them showing up. When I needed help with homework, I was on my own. Despite this, I managed to do well in school. It was my escape in a way. Teachers were often the only adults who showed any interest in my well-being. There was never any physical abuse, but the emotional neglect was constant. My parents would criticize everything about me: my appearance, my interests, my friends. On the rare occasions I was allowed to have friends over, nothing was ever good enough. They'd compare me unfavorably to the children of their wealthy friends, asking why I couldn't be more like them. As soon as I turned 18, I left and never looked back. I'd been planning my escape for years, saving every penny I could hide from my parents. I put myself through college, working multiple jobs. It was hard, but still better than living with them. I went completely no contact, changed my number, moved across the country, the works. I heard through extended family that they barely noticed I was gone. Over the past 14 years, I've built a good life for myself. I have a successful career in software development, a modest but comfortable house, and some savings. All the things my parents prioritized, but I earned them honestly. I also have close friends who are like family to me. I've done a lot of work in therapy to process my childhood and learn to form healthy relationships. I thought I'd put all the drama with my parents behind me. Then last week, I got a call from my grandmother, my dad's mom. We hadn't spoken in years, but she managed to track me down. My grandfather had passed away recently. Apparently, he'd left me a significant inheritance, a trust fund he'd been putting money into since I was born. He must have seen how my parents were and wanted to ensure I'd be taken care of. I was touched that my grandfather had thought of me, even though we weren't close. The inheritance isn't life-changing, but it's a nice nest egg that will help secure my future. I told my grandmother I was grateful, and we had a good conversation catching up after all these years. She filled me in on some family news and apologized for not doing more when I was younger. It was a bittersweet conversation, but overall positive. Somehow, my parents found out about the inheritance, and now they're blowing up my phone, demanding that I give them the money. They say I owe them for raising me and that they deserve compensation for being my parents. They're even threatening to sue me if I don't hand it over. I'm furious. They were terrible parents who neglected and exploited me, and now they think they're entitled to money my grandfather left specifically for me. No way. I told them to pound sand and block their numbers again, but I'm worried they might actually try to take legal action. Can they really sue me for this? Do I need to get a lawyer? I don't want to give them a penny, but I also don't want to get dragged into a long legal battle. Any advice on how to handle this would be appreciated. Update 1. Thanks for all the supportive comments on my last post. A lot has happened in the past couple of weeks, so I wanted to give an update. First, I took the advice many of you gave and consulted with a lawyer. He assured me that my parents have absolutely no legal claim to my inheritance. The trust was set up solely in my name by my grandfather, so it's 100% mine. My lawyer sent my parents a strongly worded cease and desist letter telling them to back off. Unfortunately, that didn't stop them. A few days after my lawyer sent the letter, I was served with actual lawsuit papers. My parents are suing me for parental support and trying to claim my inheritance as repayment for raising me. The lawsuit is full of lies about how they supposedly sacrificed everything for me and how ungrateful I am. Reading through their claims brought back a lot of painful memories. I'd tried to forget, like the time when I was 10 and broke my arm falling off my bike. I was riding alone because my parents never taught me or bought me safety gear. When I came home crying, my mom yelled at me for interrupting her TV show. They refused to take me to the doctor because they had tickets to a concert that night. I ended up calling my friend's mom to take me to the ER. My parents were furious about the medical bill and grounded me for a month for being careless. There were so many instances of neglect and emotional abuse. Times they forgot to pick me up from school, leaving me to walk miles home. I remember one winter evening when I was 13, waiting outside the school for hours in the freezing cold. When I finally got home, blue-lipped and shivering, my parents were hosting a dinner party and told me to go to my room so I wouldn't bother the guests. The lawsuit also brought up memories of their screaming fights, where they'd tell me I was worthless and wished I'd never been born. Any time I did something they didn't like, got a B on a test, forgot a chore, or even just expressed an opinion, it triggered a lecture about how I was a disappointment and a burden. There was constant criticism about my appearance, my grades, everything. Nothing was ever good enough for them. I remember when I was 16, I saved up for months to buy a guitar. Music was my passion and my escape. The day I brought it home, my father smashed it to pieces, saying I was wasting my time on silly hobbies instead of focusing on getting into an Ivy League school. One particularly vivid memory their lawsuit brought up was my high school graduation. I worked so hard to graduate with honors, yet my parents didn't even show up to the ceremony. They were on a shopping trip in New York. When I got home that night, the house was empty except for a note saying, "Congrats! We're in the Hamptons for the weekend. Don't throw any parties." That was the moment I knew I had to get out as soon as I turned 18. My lawyer says their lawsuit is frivolous and will almost certainly get thrown out. But we still have to go through the motions of responding and potentially appearing in court. It's stressful and bringing up a lot of old trauma, but I'm determined not to let them manipulate or bully me anymore. I've also been in closer contact with my grandmother. She's furious at my parents for this and has offered to testify on my behalf about how they treated me growing up. It's nice to have some family on my side for once. She's been sharing stories about my grandfather and how he always worried about me. Apparently, he tried to intervene a few times when I was younger, but my parents threatened to cut off all contact if he interfered, so he started the trust fund in secret, hoping it would help me someday. That's where things stand for now. I'll post another update once there are new developments with the lawsuit. Thanks again for all the support. It really means a lot after feeling so alone with this for so long. Update 2. Hey everyone, I'm back with another update on the situation with my parents and the inheritance lawsuit. We had our first court appearance last week. It was just a preliminary hearing, but it was still incredibly stressful. Seeing my parents in person for the first time in 14 years brought up a lot of emotions. They looked older, of course, but still had that same entitled, arrogant attitude. My mother was dripping in expensive jewelry, and my father was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. Their lawyer tried to paint this picture of devoted parents who sacrificed everything for their child, only to be cruelly abandoned. It was infuriating to hear such blatant lies. They claimed they had given me a loving home, paid for the best schools, and supported all my endeavors. In reality, I went to public school, and they never attended a single school event. They talked about family vacations that never happened, and hobbies they had supposedly encouraged, when in fact, they had actively discouraged any interests I had. My lawyer did an excellent job countering their claims. He presented evidence of my work history starting at age 14, school records showing my parents' lack of involvement, and even some old medical records documenting untreated injuries and illnesses. He had statements from some of my old teachers who had tried to contact my parents about concerns for my well-being but never received any response. One piece of evidence that seemed to really impact the judge was my high school yearbook. In the parent dedication section, where most kids had heartfelt messages from their parents, mine was blank. My lawyer pointed out that this was because my parents hadn't even responded to multiple requests from the yearbook committee. The judge seemed skeptical of my parents' case from the start. She asked pointed questions about why they never reported me as a runaway if I had truly abandoned them at 18. She also wanted to know why they had made no effort to contact me in 14 years if they cared so much. My parents fumbled their answers, contradicting each other and getting defensive. My mother claimed she had tried to call me many times, a lie I would have known if it were true. My father said he thought I needed space to grow up and didn't want to interfere with my life. It was almost satisfying to see them squirm. Mostly, though, it just made me sad to see how pathetic they really are. The most dramatic moment came when my grandmother testified. She described in detail how my parents had neglected me and how she had tried to intervene, only to be shut out. She recounted times she came over to find me alone as a small child, unfed and unwashed. She talked about how my parents would pawn me off on relatives for weeks at a time while they went on trips, ignoring my school, events, and extracurricular. One incident she recalled was when I was about 7. My parents had left me with her for a weekend, which turned into a week, then 2 weeks. They claimed it was a business trip, but my grandmother later discovered they were actually on a luxury cruise. When they finally picked me up, they acted annoyed, as if caring for me had been a huge imposition on her. My mother even lunged at my grandmother, screaming that she was a liar. Security had to restrain her. It was chaos. My father just sat there with a stony expression, not even attempting to calm her down. The judge was not impressed and scolded my parents for their behavior. In the end, she said she would review everything and issue a ruling soon on whether the case could proceed, but she strongly hinted that she was inclined to dismiss it. My lawyer is confident it will be thrown out. As stressful as the hearing was, I actually feel relieved. For so long, I carried the fear that maybe I was wrong, that I had misjudged my parents. Seeing them in court, hearing their lies, and watching their masks slip validated everything I've felt all these years. They truly are selfish, abusive people who never cared about me. I'm still processing a lot of emotions from the hearing. It brought up so many old memories and feelings. But I'm proud of myself for standing my ground and not letting them manipulate me. Whatever the judge decides, I know I'm doing the right thing by keeping them out of my life. I'll post a final update once we get the official ruling. Thanks again for all the support. It's really helped me stay strong through this. Update 3. Final update on the inheritance situation. The judge issued her ruling yesterday, and as expected, she dismissed my parents' lawsuit entirely. She called their claims frivolous and without merit, even going so far as to order them to pay my legal fees. In her written opinion, the judge didn't hold back. She noted the overwhelming evidence of my parents' neglect and abuse, citing specific incidents from my childhood that emerged during testimony, like the broken arm and the times I was left alone for days. She highlighted that my parents hadn't attempted to contact me for 14 years until money was involved, emphasizing that their lawsuit was motivated purely by greed, not genuine concern for me. The judge was particularly critical of their behavior in court, stating it demonstrated a continued pattern of prioritizing their own interests over their child's well-being. My parents were in the courtroom when the ruling was read. My mom started sobbing dramatically, while my dad just glared at me. I kept my composure, but inside, I felt an enormous sense of relief and vindication. It was as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had finally lifted. As we were leaving the courthouse, my dad tried to approach me. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, but instead, he hissed that I was ungrateful and that I'd regret this. He claimed I would come crawling back when I needed them. My lawyer quickly stepped between us, telling my dad to back off. It was a stark reminder of why I've kept them out of my life for so long. They're incapable of taking responsibility for their actions or feeling genuine remorse. In their minds, they'll always be the victims. I'm glad this ordeal is over, but I know it's not really the end. My parents will probably try to harass me again in the future if they think they can get money out of me. I'm determined to stay strong and maintain my boundaries. Thank you all for your support through this process. It truly made a difference. I'm going to discuss with my lawyer the possibility of getting a restraining order, given my dad's threatening comments and their behavior in court. I believe I have a solid case for one. This whole experience has been draining, but also cathartic. I've finally told my story and had it validated by a court of law. I no longer carry any doubt or guilt from those years of gaslighting and manipulation. It's like the fog has finally cleared. I've been thinking a lot about my grandfather since all this started. I wish I had known him better. My grandmother has shared more stories about him, revealing that he was a good man who truly cared about me. I'm grateful for the gift he left. Not just the money, but the knowledge that someone in my family was looking out for me all along. For now, I'm focusing on moving forward. I plan to take some time to relax and process everything. My friends have been incredibly supportive throughout this ordeal, and we're planning a small celebratory dinner this weekend. It feels good to have people in my life who genuinely care. I'm considering using some of the inheritance for my first real vacation, somewhere tropical where I can sit on the beach and forget about family drama for a while. Maybe I'll finally learn to surf or try scuba diving. I want to start creating positive memories to counteract the negative ones from my childhood. Long term, I'm thinking about starting a small foundation to help kids in situations similar to mine. Perhaps a scholarship fund for teens working their way through school, or support for programs aiding neglected children. It's just an idea now, but I like the thought of transforming this negative experience into something positive for others. I know I still have a lot of healing to do. The lawsuit resurfaced many old wounds. But I feel stronger for having faced it and come out on the other side. I stood up to my parents, told my truth, and was believed. That means more than any inheritance ever could. Thank you all again for your support throughout this crazy situation. It has meant more than you know. Your comments and advice helped me stay strong when things got tough. I'm looking forward to putting this behind me and focusing on the positive aspects of my life. Here's to new beginnings and chosen families.